loyalty in the fans to me means everything, because I'm nothing. We're nothing without the fans. I'm a fan. That's why I know it sounds good, because I'm a fan too. I know what they want to hear.
Steven Adler didn't just lose his job. He lost the band he helped build, the friends he grew up with, and the dream that had defined his life since he was a teenager. For decades, fans have heard the same explanation. His substance addiction made him unreliable, leaving Guns N' Roses with no choice but to fire him. But was that really the whole story? Adler has spent years insisting there was far more happening behind closed doors than the public ever knew. So was Steven Adler simply the drummer who couldn't hold it together? Or did the world's biggest rock band quietly rewrite the story of one of its own founding members? What really happened to Guns N' Roses' original drummer? The brotherhood that built Guns N' Roses. Long before stadiums, before tens of millions of records sold, before any of the wreckage that followed, there were simply two hungry teenagers with an entire shared dream and nothing yet to show for it. Steven Adler met Slash at around age 13, and rather than sitting through 7th and 8th grade like everyone else around them, the two boys skipped school together instead, bonding over a shared obsession with music and an equally shared belief that stardom was somehow already waiting for them. That early friendship became the real foundation underneath an entire band, a bond built years before Axl Rose, Izzy Stradlin, and Duff McKagan ever entered the picture at all. Adler and Slash first played together in an earlier outfit that eventually splintered and reformed multiple times under different names before finally settling into the lineup. History remembers real momentum only building once. Adler picked up the drums seriously as a teenager, determined by his own later account to earn a spot inside a scene that rewarded almost nobody without real, sustained effort behind it. What eventually formed wasn't simply a band in any ordinary sense. It functioned instead like a gang. A real family unit built entirely out of 5 young men who came from very little and shared a single consuming ambition to conquer an entire industry together. They lived together, struggled together through years of nothing, and eventually broke through together in 1987 with an album called Appetite for Destruction, a record built on chemistry between 5 specific people that no replacement lineup could have ever fully recreated afterward. Slash himself has repeatedly credited Adler's particular playing style, a loose, swinging, almost effortlessly groove-driven approach, as one of the defining ingredients inside that entire sound. The specific feel running underneath songs like Sweet Child O' Mine, Welcome to the Jungle, and Paradise City that helped separate an entire band from every other hard rock act of that same era. Real success, however, arrived alongside real temptation. And for 5 young men barely out of their teenage years, the sudden excess that came bundled together with massive fame proved almost impossible to properly navigate. For 4 of them, that excess remained survivable. For Steven Adler, it ultimately proved completely catastrophic. Adler's fall reads, in a lot of ways, like an entire genre of classic rock tragedy compressed into one single career. As the band's success grew larger and larger, whatever demons had already been quietly waiting in the background of an otherwise ordinary childhood suddenly found room to fully take over. Heroin became his substance of choice specifically, a habit that escalated in near direct proportion alongside the band's own rising fame. And in his own memoir, Adler later admitted believing he could somehow manage it, an assumption shared casually by nearly everyone else around him at the time, right up until it had already taken hold far too deeply to undo. In a separate interview, he described that very first use in almost spiritual terms, insisting the substance had briefly erased every trace of fear and insecurity he had ever carried, delivering a feeling of total control that would not last nearly as long as the addiction underneath it eventually would. 1980s rock excess was already legendary as an entire cultural moment, and Guns N' Roses arguably embodied that excess more completely than any other band working during that same era. Yet while every member of the band indulged to some real degree, Adler's own addiction became uniquely debilitating in a way the others largely avoided. Arriving late to rehearsals, nodding off entirely during recording sessions and playing erratically enough during live performances that the rest of the band, Axl Rose and Slash in particular, both still managing their own separate struggles at the time, grew increasingly frustrated watching it unfold in real time. Multiple warnings followed, and the band eventually required Adler to sign a contract ahead of recording Use Your Illusion, a document stipulating financial penalties for continued substance use, an arrangement Adler has since described honestly as something he genuinely tried and repeatedly failed to uphold, insisting the sickness underneath the addiction simply overpowered every good intention he brought into that same room. The moment everything fell apart, real tension finally reached its absolute peak during recording sessions for a track called Civil War, a song eventually released on Use Your Illusion 2. According to the account that eventually became widely accepted across most retellings of this same story, Adler simply couldn't perform the song adequately due to his ongoing addiction, and after reportedly dozens of failed takes, the band quietly brought in Matt Sorum, the drummer who became his official replacement. Adler, for his part, has always told a different version of that exact same session. He has insisted for decades that he was, in fact, actively improving during that period, but that opiate blockers he was using in a genuine attempt to get clean left him physically sick and unable to play at his normal level, a medical complication rather than a simple lack of effort, and one he maintains the band never gave him real room to work through. Whether that firing reflected an honest, unavoidable business decision or something closer to a calculated restructuring disguised as one remains, even decades later, the single most debated question inside Adler's entire public account of his own career. The contract itself, according to Adler, functioned less like an ordinary professional agreement and more like a final ultimatum, dressed up in financial language, a document he has said he approached with genuine intention to honor, only to discover that intention alone couldn't undo years of physical dependency built up long before anyone in the band had ever put a single clause down on paper. Official termination arrived in July of 1990, a moment Adler has consistently described as a complete shock arriving without any real warning attached to it, comparing the experience directly to being discarded by his own family after everything the five of them had already built together. What followed immediately afterward was swift and financially significant. A lawsuit against his former bandmates that eventually settled out of court, reportedly delivering Adler roughly $2.25 million alongside 15% of ongoing royalties tied to the recordings he had already played on. No settlement figure, however large, could ever fully compensate for what actually got lost that same year. An equal seat inside the band he had personally helped build from absolutely nothing. Adler's account of his own exclusion didn't actually end in 1990. It resurfaced again in an eerily similar shape a full quarter-century later, during the band's celebrated Not in This Lifetime reunion. When Guns N' Roses began rehearsing for that reunion tour in 2016, Adler was reportedly booked for what functioned initially as a genuine comeback opportunity, a planned solo appearance built around him specifically ahead of the tour's warm-up show at the Troubadour in Los Angeles. During those same rehearsals, however, Adler suffered a back injury serious enough to require minor surgery, sidelining him for roughly 2 weeks at exactly the moment the band needed total reliability from every single member involved. Rather than waiting on a recovery timeline or restructuring the show around a two-drummer arrangement already under consideration, the band simply moved on without him. Duff McKagan reportedly delivering that same difficult news over a phone call that, by Adler's own later account, briefly reignited every bit of old resentment from 1990 all over again. An emotional exchange that ended in anger before Adler tried calling back almost immediately afterward to apologize. That single moment matters far more than most retellings ever give it credit for. It reveals that the pattern separating Adler from full, equal participation in his own band was never purely about addiction at all. An entirely physical setback, unrelated to substances or reliability in any way, was enough on its own to keep him permanently on the outside of a reunion built specifically around restoring the original 1987 lineup. Decades of public narrative had trained an entire fan base to associate Adler's exclusion exclusively with substance use. Yet the very moment a real reunion finally arrived, an ordinary injury proved just as capable of keeping him sidelined, a detail that quietly complicates the entire official story in ways few documentaries have ever properly explored. The years that changed Steven Adler forever. Following his firing, Adler's life entered a downward spiral that stretched across years rather than months, his addiction deepening under the combined weight of depression and a very real sense of betrayal. While his former bandmates embarked on the massive Use Your Illusion World Tour, filling stadiums across an entire planet, Adler watched from the sidelines entirely, describing that specific experience as a uniquely painful kind of exile, a front-row seat to watching the exact dream he had helped construct succeed completely without him anywhere inside it. The years that followed brought numerous arrests, serious health scares, including a stroke in 1996, that affected both his speech and his motor control, and highly public battles with addiction that eventually played out for a national television audience on Celebrity Rehab with Dr. Drew. During one particularly raw moment on that same program, Adler admitted wanting nothing more than his band and his brothers back, acknowledging directly that he understood exactly how badly he had damaged something that had once meant everything to him. Throughout those difficult years, his stated regret was never really about lost money or lost fame at all. It centered instead on the broken brotherhood itself, the unfinished music, and the specific pain of watching something he helped create move forward as though he had never really been part of it in the first place. That sense of exclusion carried its own distinct weight, separate from the addiction that had caused it. Adler repeatedly drawing a clear line in later interviews between the financial settlement he received and the far less tangible loss of an equal seat inside the only family he'd ever really trusted completely. Money, by his own account, was never really the thing that kept him awake at night. It was the music the five of them never got to finish making together, and the specific recurring feeling of watching an entire dream succeed exactly as planned, just without him standing anywhere inside the frame. Adler's story hasn't existed entirely without genuine moments of life. When Guns N' Roses were formally inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2012, Adler took part in that same ceremony, performing alongside Slash, Duff McKagan, Matt Sorum, and Gilby Clarke, though both Axl Rose and Izzy Stradlin were notably absent from that same stage. Adler later described the experience as genuinely thrilling, while still acknowledging honestly that it never quite felt complete without the two men he considers essential to what he calls the real version of the band. A more emotionally significant moment followed once the Not in This Lifetime reunion tour launched in 2016. Adler making a handful of guest appearances across select cities to perform 2 songs from the band's original catalog. For longtime fans who had followed his very public decline for decades, watching him return to a stage alongside Slash and Duff carried real emotional weight. Adler himself later describing those specific nights as some of the very best of his entire life, simply for the chance to stand beside old friends again. Even so, those same guest appearances only ever amounted to brief, temporary visits rather than any real restoration of full membership, underlining exactly what had actually been lost back in 1990, an equal, permanent partnership inside one of rock's most successful bands, rather than an occasional invited cameo. In 2019, reports surfaced describing a self-inflicted stomach wound, later clarified by representatives as a minor, accidental injury, rather than anything more serious, though the incident still briefly returned public attention to an ongoing fragility that had followed Adler for the better part of 3 decades by that point. The comeback nobody saw coming. Between the firing itself and the eventual reunion decades later, Adler never actually stopped playing, even during the darkest stretches of active addiction. Short-lived projects, including Road Crew and later a band billed simply as Adler's Appetite, kept him working across smaller venues throughout the 1990s and 2000s, none of them ever approaching the scale of what he had already lost, yet all of them functioning as a genuine, ongoing attempt to recreate some version of the exact chemistry that had once made Guns N' Roses feel less like a job and more like an entire family unit. Reality television eventually intersected with that same period as well. Celebrity Rehab offering unusually raw, unfiltered access to a recovery process playing out entirely in public rather than behind closed doors. Footage that shaped public perception of Adler for an entire following generation of viewers who had never actually seen him perform live during the band's original run. Rather than remaining permanently defined by a single decades-old firing, Adler has spent recent years actively rebuilding a solo career, and, more specifically, an entire public identity separate from Guns N' Roses altogether. Working alongside branding strategist Ricky Lee Travolta, sometimes described in entertainment coverage as an idol maker for his work repositioning legacy performers, Adler has leaned fully into re-establishing himself as rock royalty in his own right, rather than simply as a cautionary footnote inside somebody else's success story. That repositioning points specifically toward real, verifiable accolades rather than pure nostalgia. Adler's inclusion on Rolling Stone's list of the 100 greatest drummers of all time, and his ongoing credit for roughly 95% of the material on an album, still widely considered one of the greatest rock records ever recorded. That same solo era has included regular festival dates, including a 2025 appearance at Rock the Locks, alongside a Paramount Plus docuseries called Nothing But a Good Time, in which Adler has spoken with unusual candor about his own substance use during the Appetite era, bluntly pointing out that he was far from alone in that same struggle at the time. Meanwhile, Guns N' Roses itself has continued cycling through drummers in the years since Adler's own departure, Matt Sorum eventually giving way to a rotating list of replacements that by 2025 had grown to include a sixth different name entirely. A detail that quietly reframes Adler's own firing as the opening chapter of an ongoing pattern rather than an isolated, singular betrayal aimed specifically at him alone. The truth behind Steven Adler's fall. Steven Adler remains, even now, one of rock history's more genuinely poignant figures. The drummer whose particular feel helped shape an entire generation of hard rock, only to find himself pushed aside just as that same sound reached its greatest commercial success. His story has often been reduced to a familiar narrative about addiction, but the fuller picture that has emerged across more than 3 decades is considerably more layered than a single explanation ever allows. What begins as the story of a musician losing control gradually becomes something much broader, an account of fractured friendships, conflicting memories, missed opportunities, and the lasting consequences of being separated from something you personally helped create from the ground up. Each new chapter has quietly complicated the version of events many fans accepted for years. His memoir added personal reflections unavailable when the firing first occurred. Reality television exposed the long and often painful process of recovery. Guest appearances with Guns N' Roses demonstrated that old bonds had never disappeared entirely, even if they could never quite be restored to what they once were. More recently, interviews and documentary appearances have revealed a man increasingly interested in telling his own story, rather than allowing decades of headlines to define it on his behalf. Together, those moments transform what once appeared to be a closed chapter into a story that continued unfolding long after the termination paperwork was signed in 1990. Fans who once associated Adler's absence exclusively with his own personal failings now have a considerably more complicated picture available to them. Addiction undoubtedly formed a central part of the band's decision, yet later events suggest that exclusion became a recurring pattern extending beyond that single moment. During the Not in This Lifetime reunion, an entirely unrelated back injury again left Adler watching from the sidelines, reinforcing, at least from his own perspective, the painful feeling of standing just outside the very stage he had helped build decades earlier. From skipping school with Slash as teenagers to helping build one of the biggest rock albums ever recorded, and from a shattering 1990 firing to a reunion-era injury that reopened the exact same wound all over again, Steven Adler's real story turns out to be far more complicated than any single word like addiction could ever fully capture. What part of this story surprised you the most? Drop a comment down below, hit that like button, and subscribe for more real stories behind the biggest names in rock history.